a priest or a pastor sexually abuses someone, what is often intoned is this is what God wants. And I also knew I had a lot to learn, and I sat and I listened, and a lot of what I learned at workshops and readings had some value, but a lot of it, quite frankly, just landed as bullshit.
Welcome to Unspoken, a podcast dedicated to exploring the often uncharted territory of trauma and recovery. Here, we delve into heartfelt conversations with therapists, survivors, and professionals within the mental health sphere. Together, we aim to illuminate the consequences of trauma that are often obscured by silence, stigma, and shame. And today I want to welcome our guest, Dr. Jamie Marich, author, therapist, educator, survivor, and speaker. Dr. Marich has dedicated her life to talking about trauma. She's completed a TED Talk, has several publications, has been featured in the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and other outlets. Today we're going to talk about trauma, dissociation, spiritual abuse, religious trauma, and the use of expressive arts as a tool for healing. Dr. Marich, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I did a brief introduction to you and your work, but I wanted to leave some space to learn more about you and what you've done. So tell me what I missed.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. And yes, that whenever I am introduced at a talk or a podcast and people read the professional bio like that, it's an honor to hear it. And I like listeners to know that's only one side of the story. It's very much the professional me, how one of my parts of self exists in the world. Yet, especially on what we're going to talk about today, yes, I have professional know-how, I have professional insight, and I believe my status as a survivor and having lived experience navigating this uh, is what I feel is even more important to share. So I'm excited to hear the questions you have prepared.
Oh, thank you so much. And I agree that what you bring to the table is very unique, and this is such a gift to our listeners. So thank you again for your willingness to share, especially that component of your story and a piece of who you are. Can you talk a little bit, just sort of broadly, about trauma from your perspective and how it affects the body and the brain and spirit?
The working definition I use of trauma is very simple in my work and in my how I understand it as a survivor, is that trauma is any unhealed human wound.
Mm.
A lot of the great scholars out there have their own very technical definitions for what trauma is, looking at trauma in the brain, especially. Yet, I started my professional career as an English teacher. And so, whenever I'm looking at the meaning for something, I really want to know what does it actually mean, this English word that we throw around. And the English word trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound. And for me, it is the sense of woundedness. And life is a very wounding process for all of us. And so when this discussion comes up about, well, what is trauma really? Are we over defining it now? I don't think so if we can understand it as a wound, and that human wounds come in all shapes and sizes. Some are relatively innocuous, yet if they don't get healed, if they don't get the treatment they need, if they don't get the space they need, they can go on to fester and infect. And other wounds, of course, if we're using the physical example here, need significant treatment or they're not going to heal. So I really approach trauma as human woundedness. And it's not the wound or the event itself that's necessarily the problem. It's what happens when that wound doesn't get addressed. And
Yes.
yeah, and I agree with so much of the scholarship that is out there in the field that it does tend to play out in this theater of the body, as other scholars have called it, that it is a holistic experience, that it can be something that happens in a moment or it can happen over time. Yet I go to, if it remains unhealed or unaddressed, it can infect, it could get worse. And that's where long-term problems can result.
Well, I really appreciate that conceptualization of it because, well, obviously it normalizes it, number one, but number two, it talks about you're talking about the things that didn't happen
Mm-hmm.
in response to wounding, which becomes another layer of wounding in and of itself that we have to tend to later on. So, but yeah, I think that that's a beautiful and very simple and clear way to understand trauma and what it does to us um, as humans or animals, which we all are. Yeah,
Yes.
great. What would you say, or do you believe there are some common misconceptions about trauma?
I do. I think a huge misconception, I know it's one I had when I started my healing journey, so overused these days. When 20 plus years ago, when I first reached out for help, I know the barrier in my head is that trauma was only post-traumatic stress disorder, and it was only something that affected Vietnam veterans. I had only heard of trauma in the scope of Vietnam veterans specifically. And I always want to emphasize this is not putting down Vietnam veterans, of course, because they played such a huge role in getting trauma recognized in mental health spaces. Yet a huge misconception is what trauma is and just how much it affects people. And
Mhm.
then on the other side of that, there can be this sense, well, now that we've expanded the definition of trauma, it feels so overblown that everybody says they're traumatized. You can have
Mhm.
a hanged fingernail and think you're traumatized. And yes, on one hand, I do appreciate a lot of that criticism because I think even though I want to empower trauma survivors and so much of it defines my work, there is this sense that we can use our trauma as an excuse, that we can
Mhm.
use it as a barrier to not work on ourselves. It's my trauma, it's my trauma, it's my trauma. Yes, I get that. I hear that. I validate it. And continuing to cite the trauma is not necessarily going to help you address it and heal it.
Mhm.
So I think that's another misconception on the other end of things, that if we just name it as trauma, then the problem's going to solve itself. And that's not the case. We are typically responsible for doing some work, even if we do put responsibility in its proper place for who wounded us.
Yes, and that is tricky, in terms of valuing and validating somebody's history and then also addressing the injustice that goes with the fact that,
Yeah.
the survivor is the one carrying the burden of, the cost and the time and the emotional workout that goes with healing. So,
I I do acknowledge that. It's
mhm.
not fair. And I also have learned, and this is again a lived experience share first and foremost, that if I continue to just sit in the unfairness of it all, nothing's going to get better for me. And that may mean that then I can work to help respond to some of that injustice. And I think my story is just one example of that, where I did have to take a lot of responsibility for my own healing. And I try to use the platforms I have now wherever possible to speak to a lot of the injustice that happens, not just in society, in our field as well.
Mhm.
And I think when we're in a more healed state, we might be able to better address the injustice component because it's there. And I say what I say with a great deal of care to say I see you. And I like to tell a story about, I think, putting what I'm saying here into more human terms, because it was the piece of advice that really changed my life, or direction. I don't know if you want to consider it advice, but my first recovery sponsor who worked with me, who validated so much of my story as being the product of trauma, she said, Jamie, after everything you went through, it's really no wonder you became addicted and you became an alcoholic.
Mhm.
What are you going to do about it now? Now that you know, what are you going to do about it? And as I highlighted in a lot of my work with that line, what she did was she validated me and then she challenged me.
Yes.
Too often we see people challenging, shaming, belittling without any validation. Or on the other side of things, we can see people just validate, 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 but that doesn't necessarily promote people into the necessary action that they need in
Mhm.
order to heal and possibly to change things.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully stated. Yes, we need that first acknowledgement of what happened, and if we think about where and how trauma happens, that acknowledgement is typically not a part of the picture. In fact, it's the opposite. So the validation for a trauma survivor is so meaningful in and of itself and necessary. How would you say, based on your experience, trauma can manifest in people, perhaps in ways that the general public is not as aware of?
Wow. I think
I know it's a big question.
my gut response to that is, what ways doesn't it manifest?
Thank
If
you.
you think
Yeah.
of every dimension of human life,
Mhm.
physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, financial, sexual, etc. It can show up in a lot of those areas. Uh, I think a way that on the surface may make sense, but we often don't take a deep enough dive into is relationship problems
Mhm.
and the problems that we can have in intimate partner relationships, in the relationships that we have with our children, with our friends and significant others, that a lot of our inability to really see and hear and communicate with each other does come from unhealed, unresolved trauma. So I think that's one way. I think another way is what we talk about in pop psychology sense as the imposter syndrome.
Mm.
People not taking risks, let's say, in their work life. And a lot of that hesitancy comes from, well, I'm not good enough, or I'm not going to be able to do it. I don't believe in myself. And I think of how much of that can come from an unhealed wounding.
Right. And just not feeling worthy of the space that you're given, perhaps.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. And then the interpersonal trauma part is what self perpetuates across generations. So there's that little bit. Yeah. Great. I wanted to talk a bit about dissociation, as this is less talked about than, sort of typical trauma in quotes, and can often be inaccurately portrayed. Can you talk a little bit about structural dissociation? Maybe it's linked to childhood trauma or other things that you think are important to talk about.
Well, sure. I'll talk about dissociation in general. That dissociation, going back to word origin, because I think this is a way we can often make misunderstood, overcomplicated concepts more simplified.
Mhm.
Word origin of dissociation is to separate or divide. It comes from a Latin root. And
Mhm.
so, if you're seeking to understand dissociation even further, I would ask you to consider what is it trauma survivors are separating or dividing from,
Mhm.
even people who are just navigating stress in their day to day life. What is it that we're severing or dividing from? And the simplest answer I usually get, and that makes the most sense to everybody, is the present moment, that we want to perhaps or need to sever or divide from the present moment if it becomes overwhelming, unpleasant, painful, etc. And so much of my work around dissociation is before you try to understand dissociative parts and things that might confuse you as clinical presentations. Let's start with the forms of dissociation that we can all connect with, that we all have an experience of. And
Mhm.
usually that is zoning out, daydreaming, being here but not here in some kind of way. And I even ask therapists to consider that a lot of these strategies we learn and we practice as therapists, like the calm, safe place exercise or going to your happy place. These are adaptive dissociative techniques that we teach
Mhm.
people because it's about going somewhere else to feel better about the now that I'm in right now. So, in a lot of my writing and work, I use this hashtag or this phrase: dissociation is not a dirty word. And just let's not automatically make it something that makes us panic because we all do it.
Mhm.
Dissociation can manifest as parts or aspects of experience as well. And even there, I encourage people to go don't go as dramatic as parts that you might think of as being in a DID system or an OSDD system, even though that's part of my experience and is part of a lot of our experiences. That a lot of times how we dissociate is when the mind is disconnected from the heart, is disconnected from the body.
Mhm.
And I know many therapists have this sense of I lean into logic because that's where I feel safest,
Yeah.
or I'm always in my head, or I'm always talking because I don't want to be connected to my feelings or my body states. That is also a form of dissociation. That's a severing or a dividing of parts or aspects of self that can't communicate with each other. So, for therapists who struggle to understand what those of us with dissociative systems experience, I would say start there to think about when do you feel like your rational mind is cut off from the rest of you? Is that a protective response? Is it helping you meet a need? Because all dissociation, whether we're talking about dissociative parts on one end of the spectrum, down to, I shouldn't say down to, because I don't really like to make it hierarchical, or
Mhm.
in another form, the simpler daydreaming or zoning off, dissociation exists to meet a need. or to protect. So there's a good reason why dissociation happens.
Absolutely. And understanding the reason for me as a clinician is usually the starting point,
Yep.
honoring the why not kind of thing.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Okay. And are there, I guess, boy, I have more I want to ask you so many, but I'll stick to the script.
Where this goes, we're following you.
You are uniquely poised to talk about dissociation. Would you be willing to share about how this has informed your work, your experience?
How my lived experience has informed my work.
Yeah.
I love talking about this.
Oh, good.
This is something I'm always, it feels like I'm battling or I'm speaking up about in the field. So I was first diagnosed with having a dissociative disorder in 2004. It was when I was in graduate school. I was being very triggered by a lot of graduate school content. I was 2 years into my recovery. And thankfully, I worked with a dissociative responsive therapist who was not afraid of dissociation. And she approached dissociation as a beautiful thing and not as a dirty word. And so
Yeah.
I feel that so much of the work that I do is to try to pay a lot of that forward.
Mhm.
Once I received the diagnosis, my whole world suddenly made sense. It felt validated. It felt real. It felt beautiful. And I think what happened was because I was a pretty young professional, for a lot of years, I kind of shut up around dissociation, largely because there was this implied sense that you don't talk about being a dissociative system.
Mhm.
It's just not something that you do. Uh, and I also knew I had a lot to learn, and I sat and I listened, and a lot of what I learned at workshops and readings had some value, but a lot of it, quite frankly, just landed as bullshit. From
Yeah.
there was this sense of you're trying to over technicalize something that
Mhm.
for me anyway is just very innate, very inherent. And I think that a lot of the great teachers have tried to make it harder than it needs to be. And perhaps some of that is to try to teach therapists without a dissociative system how to work with folks who have a dissociative system. But the longer I kept hanging around, the more emboldened I felt to speak out about the lived experience of being a plural therapist with a dissociative disorder, because there's just so much we think that a lot of people miss about a lot. I mean, I could take that answer even into a couple different directions. Like even right now, I can keep this very today. I'm in a EMDR therapist networking group on Facebook, and I continually get this question or this suggestion, but I thought I'm not supposed to talk to dissociative parts directly. Or for somebody who has DID or OSDD, I'm not supposed to regard them as if they're real people. And yeah, that's one way to do it. That there are some dissociative systems where it is best that, yeah, you could acknowledge the parts, but you don't speak to them so directly or you don't work to name them. But there's other dissociative systems where that feels incredibly shaming and invalidating.
Mhm.
There's this term that is used a lot, if you talk too much about the parts, you're reifying the dissociation or you're indulging more dissociation. And this is something that many of us now who are plural therapists particularly are just speaking up against, that on the contrary, actually acknowledging the parts and the very realness that they can have and within us, for those of us who are dissociative systems, is actually the way you uh, strip the shame away.
Oh, yeah. Well, isn't that true for everything? Talking about it, acknowledging it, validating it takes, like, softens that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's an example. And I
Okay.
fully came out. As I've shared in other interviews, I've dipped my toes out of the water. Like in 2011, when my first book came out, I mentioned struggling with dissociation quite a bit as part of my complex trauma
Mhm.
diagnosis. But the more established I became, I knew that I had more privilege to be able to come out, and we did fully in 2018, as saying, hey, we are a dissociative system. And even notice the pronoun I use there, that it's very casual and common for me to use we pronouns. And for
Yes.
a lot of years, I felt like we had to zip that up because, you're an I, act like an I. And we just felt like there is more to be said by being our true selves and being out there with it. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
here we are.
Well, congratulations on 2018.
Thank you. It's been what, 7 years now since then, or
Yeah.
6 years, and every year has gotten more and more exciting. And I think the most exciting part for me about being out is how many other plural therapists I've met in this journey who
Mm.
have come out, and I'm honored that so many have been inspired by me, as several have shared. And yeah, I wouldn't have changed the coming out for the world. It was the right.
Oh. Well, it is, an opportunity to give back, which is kind of the end of the circle in terms of trauma recovery, a circle that continues to self-propel, an upward spiral, but uh, being able to pay it forward, as you talked about earlier, can be healing for ourselves too.
Yes.
Yeah, great. You often talk about systems.
Mhm.
Can you explain what you mean by this, just for our listeners? I should have asked this before the last question, but how would you describe a system?
A system. Well, it's another one of those words that has different meanings depending on the context. If you think of it in
Yes.
a larger sociological sense, we talk about the system as being something that could be problematic and we have to fight to change the system and whatnot. I think system, though, at its core, and a lot of this is inspired by Dick Schwartz, is just realizing that no one entity exists by itself. No man, no person is an island. That we are all interconnected, and whether that's being to being, that's a sense of how we're connected, or within ourselves, we're a system. The human body is a very complex system. We even in basic human biology learn there's the endocrine system, there's the nervous system, there's the cardiovascular system. And if you think about system in a biological sense, it's several different, organs and entities that work together
Mhm.
to allow the human body to work. And it's not just one system, that the human body is many systems interplaying with each other.
Yeah.
And I think you could take that similar metaphor and apply it to how the mind works. Like Schwartz will say, we're not mono minds. It's not just one single mind. And uh yeah, that's a way to understand system. So a system is something I think that does apply to all of us, even if you appreciate the body mind spirit interplay that we talk about a lot as therapists. That's a system. Yet for many of us, system is how our parts and aspects of self interact with each other. And for those of us who specifically identify as dissociative systems, or who have been diagnosed or identify as having a dissociative disorder, these parts are very real and very necessary for us.
Mhm.
And what healing can and does look like is helping this system to better function together, to help our parts and aspects of self to better communicate with each other. And I note in the Dissociation Made Simple work that not everybody likes the word system, that the word collective is coming into wider use in the dissociative community, because it does feel less technical. Somebody said, when you say I have a system, it makes it sound like I'm a car.
Oh, yeah.
I'm
Or a
not a.
computer or something like that. Yeah.
So I'm also very emphatic on letting people and systems choose the language that will work for them.
Yeah.
You're working with them clinically. So even if you don't like the word parts, there's other words that can be used. For example,
Mhm.
some people with DID and OSDD do prefer alters,
Mhm.
because it suggests, well, these alters are bigger than just parts in a general sense, than, like, let's say IFS may talk about parts. Yet I like the word parts, we like the word parts, because it does feel less pathologizing to us than
Mhm.
alters. And
Understood. Yeah.
get several different people with dissociative issues around a table who have systems, and you could get various different opinions. And my ultimate clinical suggestion is help people choose the language that works best for them.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. I do like to suggest the same. We just wait
Mhm.
and see or ask. Yeah. This is kind of an off the cuff question, actually, on the heels of your answer. Are there things that you have noticed in your work or in, your just the fact that you're in the world with a system? Are there things that people say about dissociation that you find unhelpful, offensive, etc.?
Well, first of all, any media portrayal of dissociation is typically offensive,
Yes. Yeah.
particularly this suggestion that a dissociative disorder or DID especially ultimately equals violence. To me, that is the worst thing that Hollywood perpetuates. Although I want to shout out Holly, Holly and Dylan Crumpler. They put together a beautiful film a few years back called Petals of a Rose.
Mm.
You can get that through an online search, Petals of a Rose DID. And it's a great 15-minute film that shows it through a completely different lens. And Dylan, who's a filmmaker, really has a passion about improving the way DID is looked at in media. Because I think if we're looking at both societal tropes and stereotypes and in the field, that's one of them. And they can certainly cross-pollinate, because I've heard many therapists say that a lot of their understanding of DID is about things they've seen in the movies, or their fear of working with it is because of what they saw in a movie. Then on the other end of that spectrum, a very unhelpful thing that gets said is that dissociation and DID isn't real, because you have a lot of professionals, often psychiatrists, but there's other clinicians as well, who will say it's all made up, it's all in their head. Well, it isn't all mental health struggles in our head.
Yeah.
And if
Right.
you are going to say it's all in our head, I think that's a testament to how creative and expansive the human mind can be, to
Absolutely.
help
Yeah.
us to cope and navigate. And I think a less known one, but one that needs to be commented on, is, and this comes from a lot of our allies, quote unquote, meaning people, therapists who do want to put good work out there and good models out there about working with dissociation. But there's a lot of this suggestion that there's only one way to do things, like this theory works best for working with DID in parts, or this treatment approach works best, or you have to do it this way. And even a lot of the models and approaches that even we could be critical of, I like to tell my students it's a way to do it.
Mhm.
All of these ways that are out there are ways up the mountain. And even ones that I'm not necessarily the biggest fans of can still work for some people and some
Mhm.
systems. So I really take an attitude, especially as a clinician working with multiplicity or plurality or dissociative experiences, who's really to say until we try working with a certain approach. So I just get fed up, and a lot of this is probably because I grew up a fundamentalist Christian, and I'm very concerned when anybody says this is the way of
Mhm.
doing stuff. And if clinicians are putting that out there about working with dissociative disorders or trauma, I think it shows a real misunderstanding of what a dissociative mind is like.
Mm. Yeah, and I wonder if we look for really strict rules when we don't understand something.
Oh, 100%. We look for strict rules when we don't understand something. And I take a deep breath saying this. Many human beings, particularly therapists, like to be told exactly what to do when they're uncertain, when they don't
Oh.
want to mess it up, when there's this fear of doing harm. So I want to say that because a lot of that fear comes from a justified place of I don't want to do more harm. So tell me exactly what to do. And I'm here to tell you today, the dissociative mind doesn't work that way. We won't be put into a box. And even if some of your models help you conceptualize, inevitably we're going to, using an American expression here, throw you a curveball, or just keep you on your toes. I have a lot of clinicians I consult with who will say my DID clients keep me on my toes. Yes, we do. Um, and a lot of that is because of the expansiveness of the human mind. And I know I go to what a dear mentor and friend of mine, Kurt Rounzen, who was an early EMDR trainer, said, and this is in the book Dissociation Made Simple, that if you want to be a good therapist, find a DID client and really listen to them.
How would you say loved ones and friends can support someone who has experienced trauma or dissociation?
It's a beautiful question. Empathy goes a long way.
Hmm.
Yet the both and of that is you also have a right to set your boundaries and most definitely a responsibility to take care of yourself too.
Mm,
Because it can be hard loving anybody who has a mental health issue or an addiction issue. I don't think it's unique to dissociative identities yet. Sometimes what can make dissociative identities difficult is you may not know what you're getting any given day. But I know a lot of partners and a lot of family members can learn how their loved one's system works. And
mhm.
again, it's not for making excuses, yet it's for developing solutions together that can help with the communication. Yet I also go to what I said earlier in this interview about therapists, that the key to understanding anyone else's dissociation and system is for you to better understand your own too.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So, like in the book Dissociation Made Simple, which is my probably book I'm best known for now, and it came out last year, I do a special appendix for family members and support of others. Yet I say, do the exercises in this book for yourself first.
Yeah, I love that.
Show me you're really committed to getting it.
And we'll make sure that we have a link to the book in the bio and all of that, so our
I bet.
viewers can find you. That's great. Well, sort of on the heels of what you said, again, there is something that I hear a lot when either a professional or a layperson is talking about dissociation, that, you might hear that it's a way to avoid responsibility. It's not, it's not a real thing. It's just a way to get out of
Mhm.
something, which obviously I have my own opinions about, but we're here to interview you. So I'm wondering if you've heard that before, and if so, how do you respond?
Of course. And once again, I don't think that's an issue that's unique to dissociation and dissociative disorders. I think any mental health condition, it's my anxiety,
Mhm.
it's my addiction, can be used.
It could be anything.
Was getting back earlier with trauma. Even it's my trauma. It's my trauma.
Mhm.
So yeah, I don't think it's unique. I That's also something I think Hollywood has really perpetuated. The movie, what is it? Primal Fear is the big one that really
Oh,
dissociation to get out of committing a crime, and any struggle can be leveraged as an excuse. I don't think it's unique to dissociation.
well, and I really appreciate the normalization of that, because it, I do feel like as part of the conversation, that piece is often weaponized against the condition. And we're talking with people who have experienced the most traumatic of the traumatic, and then we're minimizing their experience at the same time. So I appreciate you speaking to that.
Sure.
Let's see. Let me go on. So is there anything else on the topic of trauma or dissociation specifically that you wanted to talk about or speak to that I didn't ask?
Think this is a great summary that we covered.
Okay, great. So the next section that I wanted to talk about, which you referenced earlier a little bit, is spiritual abuse and religious trauma. Heavy topic.
It's a heavy topic, and it's one of the big reasons we developed a dissociative disorder.
Yes.
It's near to our heart.
And you're not alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with that being said, this is one of those topics, goes back to the title of the podcast, that is often not discussed or is hidden well. Um, all of those kinds of things kind of exist behind the curtain of society, I would say, a lot of times. Would you be willing to begin by defining spiritual abuse and religious trauma?
Sure. Spiritual abuse is the term I tend to prefer because it's broader. It's whenever God or church or any spiritual construct, it could be enlightenment, is used as a weapon.
Mm,
When it's used as a weapon to control, to demean people. And what makes abuse is when there's a power differential.
mhm,
And so it can happen parent to child, guardian to child. It can happen um, in religious settings when we think of pastors or priests or rabbis who have abused congregants, gurus, people who look to them for help, teachers.
mm,
Uh, Yet something I really want to challenge our thinking of is it can also happen at the level of the state. Because when I first started studying spiritual abuse, The country of Iran was brought up as an example to think about how a government that is so centered around one religion can really wreak a lot of havoc on people.
Mm.
And I I say this unapologetically. I realize listeners from a variety of perspectives may be listening, but what is happening in the United States can increasingly be framed in this sphere as well.
Mm.
When people of one religion are making laws and judgments, especially from their interpretation of their religion, that affect all of us. So spiritual abuse is wide. And I use spiritual over because there's a term coined religious trauma syndrome years ago, which fits under spiritual abuse. Yet to me, it's not just religious. I want to be very clear about that. And even when I teach on spiritual abuse, I am clear to say it's not one religion I'm picking on, because you see the same patterns across really all global faith traditions. And
Mm.
even after surviving two high demand Christian denominations, I ended up in a yoga ashram off and on for 5 years studying there. And like a lot of kids who survive toxic Christianity, I was seeking something else. And so I found yoga and meditation, and it was helpful in a lot of ways. And a lot of the same dynamics of God and power and control can still show up in other settings. So that's why I lean into spiritual abuse, because I think it's a wider term. And then there can be various forms of it. For example, religious trauma that may be more specific to what people acquire in one brand of church.
I see. Yeah, and what you're referencing in terms of, larger system, a system could be an organization, I should say, like a governmental organization has power and it's utilizing its um, specific spiritual orientation to make decisions, and not everybody is aligned, essentially, and that can happen anywhere in the world.
Correct.
Mm, yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Mhm.
How would you say that these forms of adversity do or do not differ from other types of trauma?
Oh, yeah, it's a great question. And
Okay, I'll leave it there.
well, first, I want to acknowledge the reality that sometimes spiritual abuse accompanies other forms of trauma.
Mhm.
A classic example of this is, let's say, when a priest or a pastor sexually abuses someone. What is often intoned is, this is what God wants.
Mm.
And it's not just priests or pastors who do it. Parents or relatives who can abuse will say things like, God wants you to keep this a secret. So that happens where God and spirit can be brought in to other forms of abuse. In physical abuse and emotional abuse, parents may hold the honor your father and your mother commandment over people, that you can't speak up, that you have to do what I say because the Bible says you have to honor your father and your mother. And so to me, that's a misuse of a fine teaching.
Mm.
So that's one thing we want to acknowledge, that spiritual abuse can be used as a bolsterer for other forms of abuse. Yet it can happen as its own thing for a lot of, like, when I look back at my story, and I have had other forms of abuse and assault over the years. If you would have taken those away from my story, just what my parents, especially my one father, put me through in his church would have been enough to mess up my head.
Mm.
And I think what can make spiritual abuse especially volatile for certain kinds of people is, I am someone who really longs and yearns and craves for spiritual connection. I still consider myself a spiritual person. I even like a lot of things about religion in a way that some people will look at me and say, how do you still go to church? How can you still like God so much? And my short answer is, I have no issue with God. It's what people have done in God's name that's the problem.
Mm. I really appreciate that distinction because spirituality is such an important part of many people's lives and healing and all of that stuff. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people who've gone through similar things to what I did would walk away saying, I just don't want anything to do with it anymore.
Hmm.
Yet for me, it was so wounding, because everything in me wants that spiritual connection. And to be told in very cruel and diminishing ways that I was wrong as a person, that who I am is horrible in God's eyes. was just very cruel. So my story is a bit unique because my dad was evangelical, my mom was Catholic, and they didn't like each other's religions, but they hated a lot of the same things in common. So as I share in my memoir that's coming out, I got double hit on both on
Yeah.
two sides of Christianity. And especially as a person who identifies as queer, it was hard because misinterpretations of scripture are often used to berate gay people, transgender people, people who are marginalized in any way.
I'm so
And
sorry. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, thank you. And I hope one of the biggest things I can do now for people is to name it, because a lot of people, until they hear someone on a podcast or on a lecture or in a book talk about it, don't even realize that they can claim spiritual abuse as a form of abuse. Because the other misconception about that is, well, you must be talking about cults when you're talking about spiritual abuse, like the kind of cults that get a Netflix documentary. And
Mm-hmm.
to be clear, cults are spiritually abusive by and large, and certainly work in other forms of abuse too. But I really want to get people to see how it happens on Main Street, how it happens in any religion or spiritual practice that's out there, that no one religion is the sole offender here.
Mm-hmm.
And wherever there is something spiritual and a power differential, there's the potential for misusing that.
Absolutely. And I guess that speaks also to the title of your memoir.
Yes.
I'll let you say, but to me reflects a component of betrayal.
Yeah, well, the memoir is called You Lied to Me About God. And
Mm.
I purposely put it out there like that to get people talking, like, well, what does she mean by that? And the fundamental meaning is I was taught so many lies, either about the nature of God or about my own nature in God's name.
Uh-huh.
You're going to hell because XYZ. And when you're a kid growing up in this soup of church in your home, you don't really know any better. And so much of what the title means is, as I engaged, especially in my own trauma recovery, as I engage in my own spiritual explorations, I learned that God is something so much bigger and greater and more loving and more merciful and more healing than anything I was taught growing up, or anything that I think can be presented in many institutional settings. It's kind of like going back to the model I gave with, or the example I gave with working with dissociation. When you try to put God in a box,
Mm.
you're inevitably going to have problems.
Yeah, well, talk about coming out on the other side.
Yeah, that's what I hope our story is a testament to.
I think it is. Yeah. Okay. So I did want to check about, I just want to see how you're doing because I have one more section that I can ask about.
That's
Are you
fine.
you
Have a
good?
hard stop, so we can keep going.
Okay. Okay. I was just going to ask about writing and, including creativity in the work, and I'll keep that short and then
Yeah.
we'll call it a day. Okay.
So
Okay.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh, I didn't know if that was the starting
Oh no,
discussion.
I got a question to help.
Go with the question. Okay, good.
Yeah. So writing and creativity seem to be significant to you as both an author and a survivor and a clinician. And it seems like you incorporate expressive arts into your clinical work.
Mhm.
Are there misconceptions about including creativity into clinical work, maybe particularly with this population? Like some people think, oh, you've got to be a good artist to do creative work or expressive arts or whatever in therapy, something like that.
Yeah, well, there are certainly people who put that out there, that you have to have all this training specifically as an art therapist, as a music therapist, as a dance therapist to do this kind of work. And even though I do have training as an expressive arts therapist, I will say we are all expressive beings. And one of the premises of expressive arts therapy is that there's a lot of premises of expressive arts therapy is to focus on process over product. So being in process with somebody, uh, being a creative collaborator with somebody, and keeping an open mind to solutions about, well, let's try this skill, let's try that skill. Have you ever thought about leveraging any of your hobbies? So I think any good therapy is a creative act.
I
And
love that. Yes, it is.
Yeah. And I would say if you are a person who relishes creativity and expression yourself, that if you have practices from your own life that feel that they would be worth sharing in the clinical process as solutions, yeah, share them. I am not one who gets, you could probably tell this from the interview so far, who gets caught up in pretentiousness about.
That's so weird because I thought the opposite.
Right. You have to have all this sophisticated training to just keep a pad of paper and some crayons out in your office and leave it there as a vehicle if a person gets stuck talking in words.
Mhm.
Um, so I did write a book. This was a 5 year ago project called Process Not Perfection: Expressive Art Solutions for Trauma Recovery. And I wrote that book for a couple of reasons. One, to be an adjunct to the therapy process, especially for folks who maybe can't access an expressive arts or a creative arts therapist in their community, that I'm sharing with you a lot of my best of practices that can certainly be aligned alongside other forms of therapy. And to also keep an open mind to the idea that, yes, therapy is helpful. That's why so many of us got into this field. I know I've benefited from therapy. I enjoy practicing therapy. And sometimes your greatest healing comes from literally learning how to climb that mountain or to run that race or to take that dance class that's maybe always scared you or to color along with your kids. If you're a parent or a grandparent listening to this and your kids have art supplies out, how about joining them?
Yeah, it's just about being with.
Yes. And maybe then noticing, again, keeping an open mind to what happens.
Love it. Yeah, great. Why would you say that this is an essential? I mean, maybe you didn't say it's essential, but I'm kind of thinking it is, that having creative outlets for people with trauma is really important because sometimes art can say things that the mouth cannot.
Well, it's going back to one of the first things we talked about, how unhealed trauma can play out in the body, that often the manifestations of it don't come out in words, but they
Mm.
come out in actions or behaviors. So why not engage in processes that help us work with the things that we can't easily put words to? And I'll say this even as a writer, and writing is so much the craft of working with words. I am able to better write when I also do artwork and when I dance and when I move and when I listen to music. That typically before I sit down to any day of writing or any process of writing, I'm doing some other expressive art first.
Oh, yeah. So that inspires and gets you going. Yeah, that's great.
Opens the channels might be a
Oh,
way.
yeah, yeah. That's a great way to say it. It does do that. I mean, creativity does for me too, as well. Let's see what else I wanted to ask you. Hmm. You already answered that question, actually. Okay, so we're towards the end. You have a lot on your plate.
Do.
And yeah, and have really contributed in a lot of ways to the field. Can you share current and upcoming projects? You reference them, but share again for our audience.
So this year in 2024, the two big projects that I've been talking about are connected to dissociation. The first is Dissociation Made Simple now has a flip chart out because clinical flip charts have become more popular.
Yeah.
So the book, which I published last year, that was really a collaborative effort between me and 61 other folks that I interviewed and put the thoughts together in the book, now has a flip chart to hopefully make it a little easier for clinicians and people working with clinicians to work with. And then You Lied to Me About God is coming out in October. And so that has been the great soul work of my last couple years, just being able to do the creative processes, like a lot of poetry and art, that got this memoir out of me. And I'm the type of clinical writer because so many of my past books are either written for clinicians or for that professional voice that still tries to reach a general public. But this is really pure memoir that hopefully still does some teaching through it. Because I told the people who follow my work and even my publisher who has been supportive of me writing a book on spiritual abuse, I said, I can't put this book and this work out there unless I can get personal, like really personal with it.
Mhm.
And so that's been the big thing I've been working on. So
Yeah, congratulations. It's very exciting.
thank you. Thank you. And I invite listeners of the podcast to check out redefinetherapy.com. That's a free website that I have that has basically everything I've done for free online. I put podcast interviews there that I've done, a lot of videos, skill videos, articles that have a lot of my work I can share, and also links where you can get the various books and the various projects.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. We'll include links to that page as well, your site there. I do have one follow-up question. How do you navigate? I mean, do you currently still see clients?
I do a handful. uh,
Uh-huh.
mhm.
How do you navigate them knowing your story? Like your book is going to be out there,
At this point in my career, most people seek me out because of my story.
I'm sure. Yeah.
So it's not really an issue for me right now, but at earlier points of my career, when I saw higher volumes of clients, people who didn't necessarily know a lot about me, I just took it as many things in therapy on a case by case basis.
Gotcha. Great. Okay. And again, that goes back to therapy as a creative process, being
Yes.
able to adapt. Okay. So, as mentioned, the podcast is named Unspoken. Is there anything else you believe needs to be spoken for that hasn't been yet?
Just a gratitude to you for asking
Oh,
questions. This has been a very enjoyable conversation for
well,
us.
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.